I'm going to try to do something good. If all else fails, I could always go back to doing bad. I was what you call an authoritarian. I was a rule guy. I'm still a rule guy. I like rules. I like rules. I like structure. I like things to be a certain way.
Police make an arrest after a human torso and foot were found inside a building in the Bronx.
The suspect has been identified as Sheldon Johnson, a criminal justice activist who previously served time in prison.
All right, Fox 5's Linda Schmidt live in the High Bridge section of the Bronx tonight with more on this surprising turn of events. Linda.
Yeah, certainly surprising. Well, first of all, this guy said he had turned his life around after spending most of his adult life in prison. In fact, just last year, he started working with the Queens Public Defender's Office. Well, now he is accused of shooting a man in the head in the apartment building right here behind me and then dismembering his body. 48-year-old Sheldon Johnson of Harlem is charged with murder and concealment of a human corpse. This is Johnson recently on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about how he had turned his life around after a life of crime. He was working with troubled youth with the Queens Public Defender's Office. The shirt he is wearing says Queens Defenders. Well, police say Johnson's life of crime apparently was not over. He is accused of shooting 44-year-old Colin Small in the head in Small's 6th-floor apartment on Summit Avenue and then dismembering his body. Detectives combing over potential evidence again today. Inside the apartment in the High Bridge section of the Bronx, a law enforcement source telling me they found a man's torso and foot in a plastic storage bin. Investigators also found the victim's head, legs, and arms in Johnson's freezer in his apartment building in Harlem. The superintendent of the victim's apartment building saying a neighbor heard gunshots, and surveillance video tells the story.
The tenant of the apartment, he came in, he never came out. So I called police because it's suspicious.
The super providing me with these surveillance pictures inside the building that allegedly show Johnson carrying bags in and out of the apartment building the day of the murder and changing his clothes several times, as well as wearing disguises.
Yeah, babe.
25 years ago, a shot caller for the Bloods would find himself heading off to New York State Prison. Attica, Comstock, they were all waiting for a young Sheldon Johnson. The judge would hand down a 50-year sentence calling Sheldon Johnson a menace to society. When he seen his time computation sheet, it said that he would be released in 2049. In 1989, he couldn't see it, but it was his reality. He would find an almanac and look at what his life expectancy was. And in that moment, he knew that he would die here, inside the New York State prison system. Or would he someday find freedom? Stephen Zeidman, a City University of New York School of Law professor, would fight for Johnson's release through clemency. But Johnson would also spend his days and nights fighting for his freedom himself. Sheldon would dive into the law books and rehabilitation, daydreaming of a life beyond the razor wire and the concrete walls that held him captive. He had to find a way out. When the appeals had been exhausted, there was only one way to the street, and that was through clemency. He would write letters to Elvin Bragg, the district attorney in New York, asking for his support for clemency. He would tell the seasoned prosecutor, "I have been incarcerated 25 years on a 50-year sentence. I'm writing to you in the hopes of being given an opportunity to make a difference in the work you are currently doing. I am a product of systemic racism, intergenerational incarceration, a product of trauma, the school-to-prison pipeline, and crack-era Reaganomics. At a ripe age of 10, in the 5th grade, I was arrested and shuffled through mental institutions, group homes, and then dumped into the streets. I am a CODA, child of deaf adults, a biracial union of love where my parents were ostracized and stigmatized because of the opposite color of their skin. I do not pretend to be a victim, but a survivor of unprecedented adversity. Mr. Bragg, I believe in change. I am a product of change. I believe that anything that does not change is not alive. I have spent the last 25 years in introspection, heavy reflection, self-rehabilitating. I am an advocate against gang recruitment and violence. I have created a number of programs that are geared toward helping at-risk youth identify the culture associated with gang violence and addressing deep-seated traumas that push these children into the street where they end up making terrible life-altering decisions. Not long after, Sheldon Johnson would find his release through Governor Hochul and clemency. On May 25, 2023, his dream of being a free man had finally come. He would walk out of New York State Prison to his newfound freedom that seemed so far away. It wasn't 2049. Now it was his to be had. Would he embrace it or throw it all away? Who is Johnson and who is his family? Johnson Jr. began selling drugs on the streets of Harlem when he was about 17 years old, according to his father. Johnson would once say, "I had this analogy in my head when I was up in the clouds and I'm looking down. And I said to myself, I just came from the bowels of hell, spending 25 years in prison, and now I'm in the sky above the clouds in heaven." He walked out finally with a plan. After 25 years, he would become a prominent criminal justice reform advocate. Sheldon had convinced himself and those around him that he was a changed man. Joe Rogan would invite him on his podcast, labeling it, "Sentenced to 50 years, Sheldon Johnson decided to turn his life around." But was he lying to Joe? He would find a job where he thought his new home would be, with the Queen's Public Defender's Office. Incarceration has been no stranger to the Johnson family. He would say publicly after his release that "I'm also a product of intergenerational incarceration. My father was incarcerated when I was young. I was incarcerated. My grandfather was incarcerated. My great-grandfather was a slave." But he would leave his son out of the equation. He too was incarcerated. While Johnson was in prison for what seemed like the rest of his life, his son, also named Sheldon, would find himself on the wrong side of the law. He was with two friends on a Friday night, and they planned to pick up Chinese food, then play video games until sunrise. But they had malice in their heart as they set out for the night. They walked west along the same Harlem streets Sheldon's father and grandfather had once walked. Their nights tapping against the damp sidewalk, their jackets blowing in the wind. It should have been a quick trip to the Chinese restaurant. But Sheldon would say, "We ended up being stupid, trying to fuck with people." They spotted the mark on Broadway and 122nd Street shortly before 9 p.m. Perhaps it was the time when the knockout game was flourishing on the streets. The man's name was Ming Hai Yu, and he was a 24-year-old graduate student from China who was studying statistics at Columbia University. He had just finished eating himself and was one block from his dorm. Nobody else was in sight. Sheldon walked up on him to swing, and he started to swing wildly, hitting him in the head. Yu staggered a few steps and bolted into the street, fleeing any future punches from the youngster that made him a mark. Then a horn would blare out, a screech of tires, a bang, as an SUV slammed into Yu. The three boys took off, scared, but laughing, into the night. Security cameras captured it all. There was no escaping, only for the moment. And the next day, cops arrived at the Bronx apartment where Sheldon lived with his aunt. They told him that the man had mollywopped, passed away. In an interrogation room at the precinct, a detective that had been around a long time recognized Sheldon's name. Years ago, he was the man that arrested his dad. "He told me, 'Son, don't be like your father. Just tell us what happened,'" Sheldon recalled, as if it was out of the script from First 48. He sat there for hours, and then, around 2 a.m., he confessed. A few days later, he was on Rikers Island, the same place that his father had once spent many years. The New York Daily News labeled him a 14-year-old punk. The New York Post switched it up, calling him a 14-year-old thug. The New York Times noted that police say he is a cold-blooded predator with little capacity for remorse. The younger Johnson was charged with manslaughter and used death and would spend 18 months in a juvenile detention boot camp. In his senior citizen housing complex in Linden, New Jersey in April 2008, Sheldon's grandfather shook his head and leaned back on the couch in his living room. He was 57 years old at the time. As he read the newspaper articles, he mourned the legacy he had left. The legacy of his name, Sheldon Johnson, a name trapped in the revolving door of incarceration, crime, and poverty that is all too familiar in the New York City area. He turned to his wife, Laura, and signed a few disappointing words, and what he read with his hands shaking, Sheldon Sr. was born deaf. But being deaf did not stop him from his life of crime. The old man had tried to forget his past, but it was always there. Much of it he was ashamed of. Generation to generation, it all stems from me, he would say with his hands. I feel disappointed. I regret a lot of the decisions I made in life. It enters my mind all the time, a big, huge amount of guilt. I ruined everything. The country was a generation removed from the crack epidemic, and yet the era's impact continued to ripple through time, in the prisons filled with old addicts and dealers, and in the broken homes of their children. The old man family was still trying to escape it, but to this day in 2024, they never have. But who was he? Sins of thy father. Who are you, Mr. Johnson? And what is your legacy? But why has this family spiraled out of control? Was it a generational curse? Could Joe Rogan find out the truth? Did Joe recognize that Sheldon Johnson Jr. before him still had malice in his heart? The streets had never left. Sheldon Johnson Sr. was addicted to crack and went to prison. There were times when he wasn't the best of fathers, and not being there likely led to his son being in the streets that were waiting for him, and that they were. In 1986, he was arrested for R-ing his 7-year-old stepdaughter 3 times. He pleaded guilty. Johnson claims that he committed these acts when his wife refused to have S relations with him because she was angry at his continued drug use, Judge Joseph Falcone said at his sentencing. Falcone noted that Sheldon Sr. had no previous criminal record and was his family's sole breadwinner. Sending him to prison, Falcone said, would entail excessive hardship to the family. And so for his crimes, Sheldon Sr. received 5 years probation and no prison time. He too was not only a drug addict, but a chomo. I was surprised that they let me go, he would say. Looking back years later, Sheldon said that he had many shameful moments in his life, but this was the most shameful. He knew that he had gotten off easy and that such a crime would bring a much harsher sentence if he engaged in those acts today. Perhaps prison would have ended his life as well, had the judge sent him there. Times change, he knew, and so does the court system's choices of punishment. He believed that people could change too, even those who had committed vicious acts. But this wasn't about him, it was about his son. Or was it all about him and the path he put his family on? In 1989, as state and federal authorities pumped up more and more money and resources into the war on drugs, Sheldon Sr. was arrested when New York police caught him buying crack cocaine. He was convicted of drug possession and served over 14 months in state prison. He was arrested again in 1993, this time for trying to buy crack from an undercover officer. He spent about a year in jail. 4 years later, an undercover cop busted him again, and he spent another year in jail. By the time he got out, he had lost contact with his family. His sister did not know whether he was alive. Neither did the mothers of his children. He too walked out with nothing and no one. Would he fail or succeed? And his son Sheldon Jr., who knew sign language, was caught up in the middle when his dad needed a fix. He would help him communicate with the dealers on those corners in Harlem. Crack, the need to get that money, as they now say, and he needed to get that bag, it rose. With crack epidemic came violence, whether you were dealing or using. The drug was very cheap and very addictive. $3 back then for a 5-minute rush. Disputes over debts and territory brought more violence to America's already crime-ridden cities. Violence was in every way part of the drug trade. The federal government, wanting to end it before it got out of hand, responded by escalating the war on drugs, passing bills in 1986 and 1988 that shifted millions of dollars and hundreds of agents to the task and set a mandatory minimum sentence for first-time crack cocaine possession. The feds had no problem handing out life sentences to get you off the street, and so it went for over 25 years. Men and women from all over the country would find themselves with no release dates when looking at their own computation sheets. Obama years later would be on the changing side of these laws. By 2000, 450 of every 100,000 people were locked up in state prisons, more than 4 times the rate in 1970. A disproportionate number of these inmates were black and brown men. Harlem was a rough place in the early 80s, when even the strong would not survive, but it was especially rough for Sheldon Jr. His mother, Teresa, was white. His father, Sheldon Sr., was an addict, and both of them were deaf. His family was among the poorest in a poor neighborhood, and the tall, skinny Sheldon Jr. wore dirty clothes much too small for him. His classmates picked on him for all of the above and called him Slinky. Inside, he was hurt and embarrassed. He wanted more. His young life was on a trajectory that spelled out prison. When he was 9, he was walking down 114th Street and saw a pit bull. All kids feel joy playing with a dog. He stopped. The older boy holding the leash was 16-year-old Shamik. He offered to let Sheldon Jr. take the dog home and look after it if he wanted. Over the following week, Shamik paid Sheldon Jr. a daily allowance to feed and walk the dog. Shamik was out there getting after his own bag in the lie of street hustling. Every day, Sheldon dropped by Shamik's block to pick up his money and hang out with the cool older boys there. One day, when police cars were all over the block, Shamik gave Sheldon Jr. a brown paper bag and told him to keep it overnight. After he brought the bag back the next day, Shamik took him to the clothing store and bought him jeans, sneakers, a shirt, and a leather jacket. For the first time he could remember, he had nice clothes and they all fit. He went from Slinky to a new person in minutes. He had tasted defining things, although they were small for the moment. The people he looked up to were the drug dealers because they had what he wanted. Shamik would employ him as a lookout, standing on a corner and calling out when he saw the police. Soon he was given a new job as he moved up the food chain. Now his job was carrying drugs to the stash houses that littered New York City. He rose through the ranks quickly because he was thirsty to do better, to make more. When Sheldon Jr. was 12, Shamik promoted him to block manager in charge of day-to-day operations. His new pay was $1,000 a week, and he made sure he took care of all of his people. Finally, he had a couple dollars and could help out the ones he loved. Sheldon was always generous, his cousin Tammy would say. He didn't want anybody he loved to have to worry about money. 2 years later, as a young entrepreneur does, he wanted to find his own way. Sheldon would connect with Shamik's plug and open his own shop on 112th Street. His first day, he flipped 10 grams of cocaine for $500 in profit. After a few months, he joined forces with another kid from the neighborhood, Antoine, who'd also been hustling. Their small operation brought in thousands of dollars a week, more than they had ever seen. While some of the bigger dudes made millions each month, Sheldon was chasing that day as well as Antoine. Drug gangs controlled the streets of New York blocks, and some were owned by those that grew up there and those that could keep them with vicious violence. Sheldon Jr. and Antoine remembered the power of the top gang in their neighborhood, the Mad Madison Mob. When a member messed up or a buyer was late on a payment, the gang leaders would march them down the street naked, pointing gats at their heads. So you better get right or face that New York City street prosecution. But his days of the street life would be short-lived when he brought forth his own punishment, when someone owed him for some of the product he gave him on consignment. Robbing the man of his jewels and what Sheldon claimed was one of his friends shooting the man's girl, as well as pistola whipping the man who owned the money, he would find himself by himself with a 50-year prison sentence. In April 2008, Sheldon Jr., at 32 years old, was one of those people lost in the system as a young man. He would do an interview. He was sitting in an upstate New York prison serving that 50-year sentence. A bullet from a .357 Magnum was lodged in his right knee, protruding beneath the skin like a bump on a log. Stab wounds from his early years at Rikers and in the prison system pockmarked his body. Dark marks on his back and torso memorialized other bullets that had passed through him. A scar ran from his left ear to his jaw from the hands and a street razor of a rival gang member for the Latin Kings in the heat of a Rikers Island gang melee many years earlier. He still had the tattoo on his arm pledging allegiance to the Bloods, which he'd etched into himself during his early years in prison. This had become his family. The Bloods was all he had left. There was a large cross just below that tattoo, a dragon on the opposite shoulder, and a tribal band on his wrist. Prison ink at its best, or in some people's minds, at its worst. One day, sitting in prison, the counselor would show up to his cell and tell him that he had to call his sister, that something had happened in his family. The counselor would share no more. When he picked up the phone to make the collect call, he would find out that his son had killed someone. There he contemplated what his father had done. Left him when he was 3 years old. He had done the same when his own son was about that age. From prison, he had tried to be a better father than his own father had been to him. He had called and written home every week. His son was usually around to take the phone calls and often wrote letters back. But Sheldon Jr. hadn't heard from his son in quite some time, and he wondered, had he been lost to the street? And now, he felt remorse as if he had let his son down. He felt that he was the cause by leaving him fatherless, just as his own father had done to Sheldon. He sat alone and dumbfounded, wondering if his son too would spend the rest of his life in prison, as he thought that this too was his own destiny. Again, he felt the pain that came with the release date of 2049. But then came Governor Kathy Hochul and clemency. She was probably kicking herself in the ass now, but she released Sheldon. He walked out to a world he never knew existed, but as he would tell people, he had a plan to help the men and women left behind. He also had a plan to help those on the streets that were on the path he once was on. Johnson was out in full force, posing with the district attorney and the CFO of the Brooklyn Nets. He would go on the world-famous Joe Rogan show and talk about how he changed his life. But is that what he really did, or was he back in the drug game? Neighbors in a small Bronx apartment complex would hear the voice of a scared man cry out on March 5th, 2024, around 1 a.m. in the morning. Colin Small would yell out, "Please, don't, I have a family." 2 gunshots, or maybe 4, depending on what neighbor you hear from, would say the shots rang, and then the voice would cry no more. A neighbor named Samantha said that neither she nor her neighbors assumed that the bangs from down the hall, which she described as 2 pops, a pause, and then 2 more pops, were gunfire. Everyone's kind of saying, why didn't they call the police? No one on the floor thought that's what was happening, Samantha explained. It was just loud bangs. When the gunshots sounded from Small's apartment around 1 a.m., Samantha said she cracked open her door and peered down the hall. Seeing nothing amiss, she quickly went back inside. "I'm like, dogs are good, neighbors are good, everyone's quiet," said Samantha. "I'm bugging out." Besides, she noted the building can be noisy. It sits next to the major Deegan Expressway, and neighbors say the elevators make grinding noises. Later that morning, another neighbor phoned Samantha and said she heard someone from inside Small's apartment begging for his life. Not feeling right, the neighbors approached their super saying something don't feel right. The super wanted a wellness check at Colin Small's apartment. The police arrived at the 6th floor apartment to find a horror movie in real life. Inside, they found Small's torso and one of his feet in a blue plastic bin, while his bullet-riddled head was found stuffed inside a freezer beside his severed limbs and the other foot. Also inside the apartment was Sheldon Johnson Jr., the man who did not want to die in prison, but now he was in the apartment with a severed head and a Tyvek suit on. The NYPD is now accusing Johnson of shooting 44-year-old rival Colin Small in his Bronx apartment. I had this analogy in my head when I was up in the clouds and I'm looking down, and I said to myself, I just came from the bowels of hell, spending 25 years in prison, and now I'm in the sky above the clouds in heaven. Somehow, someway, it was all a dream because Johnson is no longer on the Joe Rogan Experience. He is back in the bowels of hell.
Cops say he's the man behind a gory homicide, charged with murder, manslaughter, and criminal possession of a weapon. But Johnson says they have the wrong man.
I'm innocent.
He's accused of dismembering a body.
I'm innocent! I'm innocent! He yells at the camera. Bro, they just caught you with a Tyvek suit on. Like, what the My man's got a Tyvek suit on. You're inside old boy's house. They're finding, body parts in there. They find old boy's noggin at your crib inside your freezer. They got video surveillance of you going in and out of the house with different bags, different wigs on, different clothing. Like, they're going to line you up at trial. You're a smart dude, right? You're an educated dude. Dudes that been to prison, that watch that Joe Rogan show, you can see, man, that dude, he's really not the dude that he's saying that he is. When he says the one part about, I decided to do right, I could always go back to doing bad if, doing right don't work out. That was already in his mind. That was already his mentality. He got a second chance. And it's dudes like him that get out and blow it in drastic ways are the reasons why dudes that are sitting in prison like Laval Farmer that can't get out. He deserves a second chance from the New York City area. I believe this dude's going to get out and do the right thing. You can tell from a person's character, from their demeanor. And, he was in there writing letters to the district attorney. I'm a victim of this and I'm a victim of that. And, bro, you went back out on the streets, man, and did some wild shit. There's some allegations that the other dude was in prison with him. They knew each other. There's some allegations that maybe he had owed him some money. And, he was playing games with his money. So old boy took it all the way back to 89 when he was with his people. And, he ends up with that 50-year sentence for pistol whipping dude. And old girl's, dude's girl gets plugged by one of his friends. You're back on the street trying to live that street life. You're trying to live two different lives, man. Either you are this dude or you aren't this dude. And obviously, man, from what happened, it shows that you're not. Usually I don't do this. Usually I don't try to down dudes that get out. But when you're one of them dudes that gets out and blows it for the other men and women that deserve a chance, yeah, I despise people like that. So now he's about to go back to prison. Remember how we talked about the heavens? Man, you're back in the bowels of hell. And there's no one to blame but yourself, brother. Blood on the Razor Wire TV. Until tomorrow, we're out.